Welcome to the CJD Foundation Virtual Conference and tonight's session, Rare Disease Drug Development 101. We thank our partners, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center for making programs like this possible. We also thank all those who have donated to the CJD Foundation or Strides for CJD. Your gifts help fund programs like this. We're pleased to welcome Laura Iliescu, Director, Patient Advocacy Strategy at the Center for Rare Diseases at ICON plc. Please enter your questions as they occur to you during the presentation. At the conclusion of the session, we will address as many questions as time permits, focusing on tonight's topics.
Good evening. Welcome to the 2022 CJD Foundation Family Annual Conference. As we approach a point where clinical trials are a possibility in the prion field, it's a good time for our community to learn more about how the process works. In the past, clinical trials in prion disease were largely investigator-driven, meaning that they were mostly repurposing of already approved medications for other indications, and funding was largely obtained through federal agencies. As industry becomes more interested in prion disease, new therapeutics will be posed that will require different study methods than what we have typically seen in the field. Learning the steps in drug development and the phases of clinical trials and what other rare disease communities have learned through clinical trials can help set expectations and give us a framework for what we might see in the prion disease field as well. We're very fortunate today to hear this overview from Laura Iliescu. She is Associate Director of Patient Advocacy Strategy of ICON. Laura Iliescu has a Master's of Science and has 20 years of experience in the development and commercialization of therapies and patient-driven healthcare services. She has held strategic development roles at leading pharmaceutical, biotechnology, contract research organizations, and clinical home care organizations with a focus on rare diseases. She leads the patient advocacy strategy team within ICON Center for Rare Diseases, where she supports collaboration between companies and rare disease patient advocacy organizations like the CJD Foundation. We welcome Laura.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Iliescu. I'm Director of Patient Advocacy in the Center for Rare Diseases at ICON plc, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here with you today and to share with you a little bit about clinical trials. Before I do that, I need to let you know that I work for ICON plc, which is a company that runs clinical research, and that ICON plc is a service provider to a number of pharmaceutical companies. And I should also let you know that I am personally affected by a rare disease through my family. And so these things may influence the information that I share with you, although my objective today is to share information about clinical trials that is general, as well as broadly pertaining to clinical trials and rare diseases, that is accurate, fair, balanced, and unbiased. And I also need to let you know that the information I'm sharing with you is based on my personal and professional experience and does not necessarily represent the opinions, views, or positions of any other stakeholders. So to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've had the honor of having a career in health sciences, and that includes about 20 years of experience in developing and commercializing treatments and therapies. A lot of those have been in rare and complex conditions. And I've also had the pleasure of working on a number of healthcare products and services, such as clinical home care and patient support programs. In my current role at ICON plc, which is a clinical research organization, I help companies who are developing new treatments in rare and complex conditions to collaborate with their patient communities. And we do that through the patient organizations that support those communities. My family, as I mentioned, are affected by a rare condition. It's called hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. It is an autosomal dominant condition. And so I have been on my own rare journey for the past few years. And I am presently north of the border where I live in Toronto, Canada. Usually the first question that I get when I say that I work in a CRO is, what is that? And essentially, CROs are, to clinical trials, a form of project manager. They get involved in all of the behind the scenes things and engaging with different stakeholders and collaborating with different stakeholders to make those clinical trials run properly and according to plan, which is very important. So that includes all of the things here, as well as many others that I will not bore you with, because the project managers are never the most interesting people in the room. I will tell you is that ICON is one of the larger CROs, and where I work in the Center for Rare Diseases, we have a small but very mighty team that is incredibly passionate about doing what we can to support bringing new treatments and therapies and clinical trials to rare disease patient communities. Many of us, like myself, are personally affected by rare diseases. And to date, the Center for Rare Diseases has worked on over 700 rare disease studies with over 100,000 people affected by rare disease from around the world and almost 25,000 medical facilities. So today, it is genuinely an honor to be here with you. And what I would love to share with you is a little bit about what clinical trials are in general, some of the very basic information, some of which you may already know, but I hope that you will get something to take away from this that perhaps you didn't know or think is interesting. Talk about some aspects of clinical trials and how they fit into the drug development process overall, and how that is a little bit different for rare diseases versus common conditions. And then touch a little bit on what it might be like to take part in the clinical trial and what that typically involves from individuals who are affected by rare diseases. And we'll also touch a little bit on access to investigational treatments outside of trials, which is something that people always want. I find people always want to know about, whether there are any other options to access investigational medicines, and I'll touch on that a little bit at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and I will do my best to answer them at the end of our session. So, clinical trials. Starting with the basics, what exactly are clinical trials? Fundamentally, clinical trials are a form of medical or scientific research, which is essentially an experiment, which may feel uncomfortable to say, but that is exactly what it is. It's an experiment that involves human volunteers who are known as participants, among other stakeholders. The type of clinical trials that I'm going to talk to you and focus on today are known as interventional clinical trials. And that means that they're clinical trials that are testing a form of intervention, so a treatment, testing to see if something that is done makes a difference, and to see if that treatment is safe and effective, which are words that you're going to hear me say a lot today. The other form of clinical trials, which I'm not going to touch on very much, are known as observational or non-interventional trials, and those generally just look to see what is happening. So we're not looking to test anything or learn about anything, we're just observing what is happening under a set of conditions. In an interventional clinical trial that tests to see whether a drug is safe and effective, a lot of information is gathered through tests, assessments, questionnaires, and other means and procedures throughout the clinical trial. And that information that is collected is designed to inform regulators and the company and individuals as to whether that product is safe and effective. So that data is really, really important, and it requires the collection of a great deal of data. So it typically involves doing a lot of tests, assessments, and questionnaires, and similar procedures. Regulators like the FDA then will look at the data that's been generated from clinical trials and review it in order to see whether they are in agreement that that product is in fact effective, has lived up to the hope that was had for it, and whether it is deemed safe, whether the side effects and, let's say, risks associated with that product versus the benefits warrant providing marketing approval so that it can be available to everybody, not just the individuals who were in the trial. Then, very importantly, there are the specialist physicians and the medical facilities where the clinical trial is going to be run, where participants will be conducting their visits. And it's important to note that physicians who take part as investigators in clinical trials function as independent researchers. So they're not working for the pharmaceutical company or for the CRO. They are functioning independently and conducting that science independently. And their primary consideration is the safety and well-being of participants. That is their legal responsibility, is not to prove that the drug is safe or effective. It is not to try and determine whether or not the study should continue. It is purely to determine whether individuals are safe and whether they are cared for throughout that study participation. So it's important to point out that clinical trials are neither the beginning nor the end of the story, actually, in drug development. Clinical trials typically only begin after there's been quite a bit of research that has taken place not in humans. So, for example, research to test potential promising new compounds, which would be molecules or other interventions, for quite a number of years before they reach clinical trial phase. Typically, this would involve computer modeling, testing in vitro, and testing in animal models. And all of that research informs whether or not what we would expect that the side effects of the product might be, and what we might expect that the effectiveness of the product might be. Will it reach the target, what that target is, and attempts to predict what might happen in a human body. So a lot of that research has to take place, and regulators will take a look at all of that, as I mentioned before, providing a green light. Now, in a standard drug development process, once the regulators have greenlit in human research to begin, there are typically, in a standard process, 3 phases of clinical trials, and they're done in sequence. And understanding these provides a little bit of insight into the logic of clinical research, which is always safety first. So typically it begins with a short study of a few weeks in a very small number of people, just to test the safety of the product, and then see what happens for the first time in a human body, followed by a slightly larger group of patients who are, potentially double or triple. We're not talking hundreds of millions. And again, the objective is to sort of test whether it's working, whether it's doing what it is that it's supposed to do in the human body, and what are the negative side effects. The emphasis is still very much on the negative side effects. And then a larger set of trials, phase 3 trials, take place if phase 1 and 2 trials indicate that it is likely safe to do so. And phase 3 trials are typically very large populations. So in common conditions, this could include thousands of individuals, and it could be a couple of these trials that are done in order to generate that data. And these are known as pivotal trials because these are the trials that that regulators will especially look to, and they could last quite a number of years. Beyond that process, once the trials are done, regulatory review begins, which can take a little bit of time as well. To review all of that data, prior to give you a sense of the scope of data that must be reviewed, prior to having modern technology, companies used to drive the data from clinical trials to the FDA in trucks. So it would be a convoy of trucks filled with binders that would arrive at the FDA, who would have to review all that. It's not the case today, but it gives you a sense of why it might take quite a bit of time for regulators to review. And then once that review is complete, marketing authorization determination would be done if the regulator feels that the trial proves that the product is safe and effective and the benefits outweigh the risks. So one thing I want to highlight here is that if you take a look at what happens to the number of compounds that a company might start with, or that we might begin with in the standard drug development process, you'd be starting with 10,000 promising, thousands of promising compounds. And as you go through research, through different phases of research, what happens, you typically eliminate quite a number of them because they unfortunately don't live up to the hope and promise that they had at a previous stage. And you learn that by going through these processes. So by the time you reach clinical research, where you might have started with 5,000 or 10,000, you might have 5 promising molecules. And as you go through clinical trials, you will learn that some of them, unfortunately, do not live up to their promise. And you'll very likely, in the standard kind of what happens big picture in the drug development industry, you might have one product that gets FDA approval based on that. So although clinical research and drug development is definitely the road to hope in rare disease, it is unfortunately a road that does have a lot of dead ends and heartbreak in it. And that's just the reality of clinical research and of the limitations of our scientific understanding at the different stages. So just to briefly recap a little bit about what is the focus of every single phase in a standard clinical trial. Typically you have phase 1, in which your focus is on evaluating the safety of the product alone. And you're looking to determine what a safe dosage is and gather evidence about that. You're looking at side effects. And this is one reason why these studies take place with very, very few people, because you would not want to expose a large group of people to side effects that are potentially unknown or risks that are really unknown for a first time in human study. And it's very common in common conditions, less so in rare diseases, for phase 1 studies to be done in healthy volunteers or a healthier cohort. And the reason for that is for the same reason, because if someone already has health burdens due to a condition, you might not want to expose them first to unknown risk. It might make more sense for that to be a healthier individual. Once those are done, phase 2 studies begin to take a look at effectiveness. Is the drug reaching the target? Is it having the effect in the body that is expected? What is the body doing to the drug and the drug doing to the body? And of course, further evaluating safety is still very important at the phase 2 stage. And then moving on to the phase 3 stage, which is known as the pivotal stage. A larger study will take a look at confirming the effectiveness as well as looking for side effects on a broader scale. Because in the standard drug development process, by the end of a phase 2 trial, we've still only had a few hundred people potentially out of populations of millions. So what we saw could have been a coincidence. It might have just been not the end of the story. Had we watched another few weeks, we might have seen that perhaps it did something different, or it didn't have the effect that we expected, or the effect didn't last. So phase 3 studies are usually very broad in terms of population and have quite a number of years in the standard drug development process. It's not uncommon for those to take several years, 2 or 3 years of participation at least. Post-marketing authorization is also not the end of the story, because quite often when a new product comes to market, we still need to continue to watch and see what happens, because in the pivotal trials, we might have had several thousand individuals, but millions of individuals may now be taking the product. And so we'll still be learning more about the effectiveness and the risk. And so phase 4 studies are observational studies where we take a look at what is happening and continue to collect that information. So what I've described so far is broadly what happens in the standard drug development process for typical conditions. I think that as I went through, you probably saw some things that made you think that this might not work so well for rare disease populations, and that is exactly why. Regulators allow some differences in approaches when it comes to rare disease. Obviously, it may not be possible to do a clinical trial with thousands of people in order to generate evidence. And so in order to allow those trials to happen, regulators accept smaller populations because, of course, rare disease populations have far more limited numbers. And then ultra rare, even more so. In rare disease trials versus common conditions, sometimes it is possible to have first in human trials in participants rather than healthy volunteers. Again, that is not always the case. Sometimes it continues to be in healthy volunteers, but depending on the condition, depending on the unmet need, and depending on a lot of other factors, including what the science looks like behind that product and what are the options for study design that are available, it may be possible to begin with patients themselves rather than healthy volunteers. And lastly, there's urgent unmet need in rare diseases. And so sometimes it is possible to combine some of these phases. So we see quite a lot of times that either the phase 1 and the phase 2 the experiment or the trial is designed in such a way as to allow that combination of this. And in phase 3, we might see either phase 1 and 2 followed by a phase 3, or a phase 1 and then a phase 2, phase 3 combination, which is really intended to try to speed to market or to deal with the fact that you have a very limited patient population, but you still want to try to generate that data as quickly as possible. So it is important to note that even though regulators allow differences in rare disease clinical research, it is research that has to remain adequate and well controlled. And well controlled means that the experiment has to be designed in a way that the regulator believes is rigorous and will generate evidence, and adequate, meaning that it has to continue to be ethical, and to be appropriately run for individuals who are taking part, with their safety as a primary consideration. And of course, must generate evidence that is compelling about the safety and effectiveness of the product. So I've mentioned trial design and the design of the experiment a couple of times so far. And it's important to understand that clinical trials, everything about them is planned ahead of time in great minute detail. Every single assessment, every single dosage, everything is planned and recorded in a master document called a protocol, which is a very, very important document. As I said, life sciences companies typically develop the protocol with input from other stakeholders, such as patient advocacy organizations and regulators and key opinion leaders, specialists. And a few aspects of the protocol that are particularly important are the eligibility criteria, what is known as the eligibility or IE criteria. And this details very specifically what kind of patient, what kind of individual is eligible to join the trial. And this is very, very important because this is designed, this is determined in order to ensure the experiment runs effectively, but also in order to ensure that the individuals who are taking part are safe and expected to be safe in doing so. As I mentioned, every single test and intervention will be recorded, and there's generally very little flexibility as to that. And researchers typically will sign on to respect that protocol. That's very, very important, and that's something that a company like ours, which is a CRO, will monitor and validate and make sure is done. Another important part of the protocol, very, very key part, is the outcomes. So what will be considered as success? What will be considered to demonstrate that the product is having the effect that's intended? These are also known as endpoints. So for example, if you wanted someone to if you wanted to increase someone's lung function or walking speed or ability, then you would have to note that in the protocol that this is what you will consider as success, as what success looks like, and then importantly, how you will measure that. And that's a very important consideration that takes a great deal of intelligent people to think through, because it's not always obvious. And how it's measured will be really important to regulators. It's often a topic of conversation for many months with regulators in rare diseases. Also, very importantly, the protocol will detail what controls are going to be used and what measures will eliminate bias. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on that because controls have a specific meaning in clinical trials. So when we talk about control in a clinical trial, we're talking about a comparison. And in order to know whether a product is working, is doing something, we really need to compare that to something else. And that can depend on the circumstances. That comparison could be for another treatment to see whether the treatment is more effective or less effective than another treatment. It could be a comparison to no treatment at all. A lot of the cases, and a lot of times in rare disease, there is just no other treatment available. Or it could even be something that is modeled, which might be called a synthetic control arm. So we have we might have the ability to come up with an approximation of what we believe would have happened to participants without that intervention. And the important thing to note is that whether these options are available or which option is available depends on many, many factors. So it is different for every study and different for every condition, and really a factor of the combination of the product, the study designs that are available to you through the product factors and the factors of the disease. And what ends up happening when we talk about control is you end up with two groups of participants in research very often. And these two groups are the treatment group, which is getting the investigational treatment, and the control group, who are getting whatever the thing that it's being compared to is. And this is the sort of thing that tickles me since I work in clinical research and I don't play Wordle. It makes a great excuse for, anything that you don't really want to do. You can just say you're in the control group. Eliminating bias is also a very important part of clinical trials and clinical research in general, because where evidence is concerned, bias is the enemy and it is all around us. It's just a fact of our human existence, regardless of whether we are people, patients, doctors, physicians. And essentially, biases lead us to believe that something is or isn't true without or despite evidence to the contrary. And this is just something that we're very prone to. And so when we design experiments, we have to intentionally include measures that eliminate that bias so that we can be as certain as possible, or as much of that bias has been eliminated, so that we can be as certain as possible that the product is in fact safe and effective, that we don't just believe that. So the factors that eliminate bias, the measures that are typically used, can be some of the most frustrating aspects of a clinical trial, because they all have in common is they remove knowing. So not knowing is what helps to eliminate bias. And three very, very common measures are randomization, which means that when you enter a study, you are randomized, you are randomly assigned. Nobody is determining whether you go into the treatment or the control arm. Very frequently you'll see randomization, so that we couldn't then say that perhaps we accidentally put individuals with certain characteristics in one group and other characteristics in the other, and that might have influenced the outcome. Another important measure that you often see in clinical trials, again, you don't always see these, but these are very, very common, is blinding. And that means not informing individuals of who is getting the treatment and who is in the control group. And that can mean not informing participants. It can mean not informing the researchers and the physicians and the study teams. And it can also mean not informing the people who are analyzing the data, in order to make sure that their analysis of the data is not potentially biased by their belief that one in the group is getting the treatment and one is not. And finally, something that everyone, it is very much in popular culture, placebo. And the placebo is a device that's used when the control or what you're comparing to is no treatment at all. And obviously that if you knew that you're getting no treatment, or if your doctor knew that you're getting no treatment, or even a data analyst, they might form certain expectations and might be tempted to perceive what you're telling them and what they're observing in your progress or in what you're experiencing through that lens. And so where a placebo is used, typically you also have randomization and blinding. These are not always possible in every clinical trial. In some cases, they may be considered unethical or suboptimal. However, these are very standard standard measures for eliminating bias, and ones that regulators generally want you to include if you can. So I'll aim to share a little bit with you about what it might be like to take part in a clinical trial for an individual who is affected by a rare condition. And before I do so, I really want to emphasize that choosing to take part is a highly personal decision for every individual. Everyone has their own set of criteria priorities, values, circumstances that are relevant to them. And it's important to note that taking part in a trial does typically require a lot of participants. It becomes a large part of your life very frequently. They can last years. There can be a lot to do. And being involved in an experiment of that size is definitely going to have some kind of an impact on your life. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And despite that, there are individuals who feel that it is worthwhile to participate in clinical research. And we're eternally grateful to them and every single person who supports clinical research in rare diseases. However, there are also many individuals who feel that it's not right for them. And it's important to note that both are right and both are valid. And the right answer for you is exactly whatever you feel is right for you. And it's really, really important to honor that. So what might the journey of taking part in a trial look like? It might begin with considering your options to see if you feel that it's something that you would like to do that's right for you, finding more information. And then if you want to proceed, it might involve going through a screening process, most likely. That could take a certain period of time and to determine whether you're eligible to take part in the trial. And then finally, it might, if you are deemed to be eligible and you choose to participate in the trial at that point, you might join the trial and be involved in taking the product and then having the tests that take a look at whether the treatment is safe and effective. So some of the things that you might do at the beginning of your clinical trial journey or exploring that is thinking about your own thoughts and feelings, looking for information about other options or what might be required of you in that trial. If you were to join, considering how it could impact your life or not, and possibly speaking with your trusted support network or your healthcare team. And anything else that you might want to do in order to determine whether this is even something that you would like to do or feel comfortable doing. If you then wanted to proceed, very likely you will begin speaking with the research coordinator at the medical facility that you would be enrolled in for the trial. And the research coordinator is the individual who interfaces with potential participants and participants throughout the trial. So they will be giving you a lot of information and answering your questions throughout the screening process. It's not uncommon for the screening process to last a number of weeks, perhaps several weeks, and to involve providing a lot of documentation to the research coordinator, health documentation and other documentation required. It will probably involve attending an on-site visit to then do a number of medical tests as well. And it's very common to require medical tests to determine whether or not to fully determine whether or not you are eligible. So along the way, you would be told based on your initial conversation whether it looks like you might be eligible. You might then provide the documentation. You might then again be told whether you looks like you're eligible and it's worth moving on to the site visit. And you might do the site visit, which is typically a fairly involved day of medical testing. Or you might do some medical testing in your local healthcare facilities and provide those results. It might be a combination of the two. And at the end of that, you would be told whether or not you are eligible to enroll in the trial. If at that stage you still wanted to continue being in the trial, you would be presented with an informed consent form. And if that was something you wanted to proceed to do, you would then begin attending the trial visits. Very, very typically, the first visit that you have in the trial is a visit that involves a lot of assessments and medical assessments, so it tends to be a heavy visit. And then regular visits are typically required during a clinical trial in order to have the drug administered. You might also be taking the drug at home, or you might be taking other medications at home. Very likely, being in a clinical trial will involve some tests that you're familiar with and you might have seen in your standard of care, but also tests that you are not familiar with and have never had before. So it's important to know and ask ahead of time about anything that you haven't experienced before. And a lot of that information will be shared with you, but it's always important to ask questions or share concerns you might have. There might be questionnaires, there might be phone calls in between. And in between your site visits, you are really asked to monitor your health and well-being and to report anything. So for example, if I'm in a clinical trial and 3 days ago I was at the site, or 2 months ago I was at the site, and this morning my Cheerios tasted a little bit different, it would be a good idea for me to report that. And the site would want me to report that back. So you are definitely monitoring your own health in between and flagging anything at all that you see or experience. And that's a very important part of the process. It's also very important to note that you have the right to stop participating in a clinical trial anytime you want. So at any point here, regardless of whether you decided you wanted to and then you changed your mind, you are not required to give a reason, and the medical team is not legally allowed to try to change your mind. And so when you do tell the team that you would like to stop participating, your decision has to be respected, and they will then help you to safely come off of the study. And this is really, really important to note, that your signed informed consent is not a contract. You are not required to continue the trial, even if you started the trial. If it's no longer right for you, you have the right to stop that participation anytime. So taking part in clinical trials is different for every person because, as I mentioned, everyone's context and circumstances, values, and circumstances can evolve for individuals as well throughout a trial. So things can change, life can happen. But broadly, when we speak with individuals with rare diseases, these are the things that they tell us are generally harder or more inconvenient about clinical trial participation. And these are some of the things that they tell us are generally easier or more convenient about being in a clinical trial. On the less convenient side, especially when it comes to rare diseases, because so few facilities that have expertise in a specific rare disease may exist, travel is often required. And it's not uncommon for individuals to have to travel across the country or perhaps even across different countries to join that study. And that can have a significant impact. Trial visits are typically long days. It's a long day at the medical facility with a lot of tests, and it can require taking time off for some folks, especially if fatigue is a feature of your condition or pain or other things that require a lot of management. You might be taking a couple of days off for each site visit, and that can be a problem that can actually be a barrier for some individuals, of course. Folks tell us, and it's intuitive, that it can be hard not to know if you're getting the placebo or the drug, if the trial that you're in is placebo controlled, or not knowing if anything is working, if it's doing anything. That can be very stressful. It's not uncommon for individuals to be questioning that and questioning, whether they're doing the right thing or whether it's right for them, at pretty much every step of the way. That's actually something that individuals experience a lot in clinical trials. For some individuals, it can serve as a reminder of the disease. And so when you're in medical research and you're constantly doing these visits, your condition is front of mind more so than it might otherwise be in some circumstances. And that's something that's been communicated to us. A lot of testing has to take place to gather data about a product, and some of those tests can be painful, uncomfortable, or tedious. Having to fast can be very uncomfortable. Having to sit still for an MRI, it's different for different individuals depending on the condition and its features. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, "I loved all those tests. Please, can I have some more?" Something that individuals might not know about clinical trials is that even though your health is being monitored very closely, you're not going to most likely get results of the tests that are being done. In some cases, it is possible, but in many cases, because of the blinding that takes place, it's not possible to give results of those tests back to individuals, and that can be very, very frustrating experience. On the other hand, the things that individuals have told us that typically they value or find beneficial in taking part in clinical research is the sensation of contributing to scientific discovery, which can be very compelling if that's something that you value. Having a chance to be seen by qualified specialists is another thing that may not necessarily be possible for everybody, and depending on the condition, depending on the country, outside of clinical trials. So some individuals find getting FaceTime and just knowing that their health is being monitored proactively by qualified specialists with expertise in the condition is something that folks have told us is of great value to them. Some folks just really like the fact that there's an option that didn't exist in the past, and now they've got an option where there was absolutely nothing else, and really want to take advantage of new options that arise. And so they find that beneficial. And some, depending on the condition and depending on the individual's beliefs and values, some folks really feel compelled to do what they can to help future generations. And that's the fulfillment that they get from, a sense of fulfillment that they get from taking part in that trial. And finally, for some individuals, taking a potential new treatment that is not yet available and having access to that is really compelling. The really important thing to note is that it is a potential. The experiment is being done because we do not know if it works. We're going to find out through the clinical trials. However, lots of individuals don't feel that way. Lots of individuals would feel wary of taking a product that has not yet been through those clinical trials and being approved by a regulatory body. So where this might sit for you or how you might feel about these things is very, very personal, completely valid, and it's entirely normal and something that we experience for these things to shift and feelings to shift and change and circumstances to shift and change throughout your journey and your journey of trial participation. So what are some of the factors that lead to successes and to failures in rare disease clinical development? I hope that what I've shared with you today gives you a sense that while clinical trials are our only path forward to new treatments and cures for rare diseases, unfortunately, a lot of the roads in drug development lead to failure and not to success stories. However, I hope that, like myself, you feel that roads that could lead to new hope and new treatments for folks affected by rare diseases are very worth pursuing relentlessly. Some of the factors that success stories have in common, I think first and foremost, the strong, active, and tenacious patient community. Rare disease progress comes from, first and foremost, from patient communities. That's always the case, driving research, driving policy, and that's fundamental. Good science, that works out. So a little bit of good science and a little bit of luck. Those thousands of molecules that did not live up to their promise, it's not that the science was bad, it's the limitations of science that don't allow us to predict with accuracy what will and won't work until we get through clinical trials. A bit of luck as well. And good trial design that provides compelling evidence when it comes to regulators to determine whether or not that drug is safe and effective. And also a trial design that is feasible for participants. Clinical trials ask a lot of participants, and it's important that what is being asked is something that they are comfortable and willing to do. Outside of clinical trials, people sometimes ask, is there any other way? I have heard there's a way to get access to an investigational treatment that is not in a clinical trial. And the answer is sometimes, but very much under strict conditions. And it might not be possible to do that more often than not. However, there are different types of programs called managed access programs is the umbrella term that they fit in, which are designed to provide access to investigational treatments outside of clinical research. The first kind of program that I'll touch on is known as expanded access in the United States. That term is used, compassionate use is more common in Europe. And these programs regulators allow these programs to take place after early trials have been completed. So there's some sense of whether or not the drug is effective. And these programs are cohort-based, meaning that if you establish an expanded access program, you'll have a set of patient criteria that is defined, and then you'll be allowed by the regulators to provide that drug if the sponsor is willing to do and able to do so to anybody who fits that criteria. So regulatory involvement is required in greenlighting that program, and it does require having a licensed physician make that request. A different expanded access, a different managed access program is the Right to Try Act in the United States, which is available after phase 1 studies have been completed. So you must at least have a minimum completion of phase 1 studies to understand safety of the product. And unlike expanded access or compassionate use, this is individual based. So it's on a named basis. An individual can make that request. Regulatory involvement is not required. That request, as long as it meets the parameters of the act, can go directly from the patient's licensed physician to the sponsor. And again, the sponsor must be willing and able to provide that product for the Right to Try program. And a similar but somewhat different program is the Named Patient Program in the European Union. Specifics for this program really vary by country, but most often for this program, you must have approval in at least one country, so the drug must have been approved somewhere. And you would need to be able to demonstrate that the individual has special needs that cannot be met by the products within the country. And again, the licensed physician will make that request, and there will be some sort of regulatory approval or sign off or notification that's typically involved. It varies by country. And the important thing to note is that for all of these, very strict criteria exists as to what the participant or where the patient criteria must have in order to qualify for the program, for taking the risk of that investigational product. And it also has very strict criteria about the product and where it must be in the development cycle, what must be known about it, and what potential risks and benefits it must offer. So these programs do exist. They're not always available, and there can be a number of reasons for that, including that it can actually be quite difficult for sponsors who are running clinical trials to supply the clinical trial, and additional supply may not be available, or there may be hesitations in terms of the risk benefit of the product, and there can be a number of other reasons. And I have included some additional resources on managed access programs in the additional resources for this section. Some additional resources that I can leave you with here to take a look through if you'd like to learn more about clinical research. The important thing is to focus on resources that are accurate, unbiased, and fair balanced to the best that you can. And I think that some of these might be quite helpful to you. So I'd like to thank you very much for having me today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And if you have any questions at all, I'll be happy to answer them.
Great.
So Laura, again, thank you very much for doing this. We greatly appreciate it. It was an excellent overview for clinical trials, especially in the rare diseases. We do have some questions coming in. Again, if you're watching this live, please enter your questions. We'll see them and try to get to them. Someone just asked, I thought, a very good question, and that was, oftentimes in this disease, unfortunately, there's a fair degree of cognitive impairment. So what determines whether or not a potential participant can consent, has the capacity to consent to participate in a clinical trial like this? How would that work?
That's a great question. So if the individual is deemed to be cognitively impaired, it is partly up to their physician to determine that, whether they are in fact capable of providing informed consent, or whether someone might do it on their behalf. Certainly, individuals who are cognitively impaired can and do participate in clinical research. In that case, it will be a caregiver or a family member who has power of attorney who will be able to consent on their behalf, and will go through that consent process on their behalf. In general, the same applies for children who participate in clinical trials, but some effort to, where appropriate, some effort to determine whether the individual themselves is willing to the extent that they can share that, participate in a clinical trial, that's also done. Dr. Appleby, do you have anything else that you might want to add from your perspective?
Yeah.
Through this process?
The institutional review boards, which are kind of the local monitoring bodies for a study being safe and ethical for participants, they usually require us to follow a template to determine whether or not a patient has what we call capacity, the mental capacity, cognitive capacity to consent for the treatment. And if they do not, then like you said, Laura, it would be a legal authorized representative. And then they also usually will have a process called assent. What basically says is that the patient can still say yes to it, but they're not technically legally consenting to it. Their legal authorized representative is. So another question that came in, Laura, is what is the best place to be based if you want to be geographically close to clinical trials? So this person is US based, she's a remote worker, so she's flexible. Mm-hmm. So what does that look like in rare diseases where there's not a whole lot of institutions doing that? What can you tell families?
That is, I think, one of the hard aspects of rare disease clinical trial participation. Depending on the trial, you might be required to relocate to a different state, potentially, or to be undertaking frequent travel to a different state. And in some cases, you might be traveling to a different country. So it's actually not uncommon in rare disease trials for there to be so few centers around the world who are experts in a condition and can run that trial that people do have to cross borders. Where is the best place to be? If you drew the lucky straw and you happen to live next to the center of excellence in that condition, then you kind of won that lottery, that postcode lottery. But that's just rarely the case that pans out that way. So a lot of the time individuals have to travel. In some clinical trials, it is sometimes possible to do some of the study visits or some aspects of the study visits remotely. And how difficult that is to conduct that travel or to do that travel depends on a lot of factors. What your work situation might look like, what your childcare situation might look like, what the features of the condition may be. Some people struggle with travel. And what I do want to point out is that as far as costs go, it's typical that your costs for travel would be reimbursed or paid up front by the clinical trial company. So you shouldn't really be asked to be paying for that plane ticket out of pocket. And if you are, you should definitely question it. So there is that, but there's of course a lot of discomfort and inconvenience that can come with long distance travel, which unfortunately is often required in rare disease clinical trials.
So I guess a similar question is, we talked about the cost of traveling, but what about the cost of the medical treatments of the study themselves, whether it be the investigational treatments or maybe medical side effects of an investigational treatment? Who pays for that?
So that's a really great question. It is no participant should ever be charged for the investigational product. That product has not been approved. So it's not legal for the company to charge for the administration of that product. And it's very uncommon for anybody to be charged for, let's say, the tests that are being done in the clinical trial. That's absolutely unlikely to be the case. However, when it comes to side effects, that's something that you would probably want to talk to the research coordinator, raise that question with the study team and understand, because it can be different for different studies. In some studies, you are not just required to take the investigational product, but you may also be required to take additional products, or you may have to come off of certain products that might have that might have health impacts. And that, again, unfortunately, is case by case. So each study will have a different set of stipulations as to whether they will pay for those additional medicines as well, or whether your side effects would, whether certain things would be looked after. However, what will absolutely happen is that your health will be monitored. And if it looks as though something is not going right, it is definitely going to be incumbent on the study team to make sure that your safety is prioritized and, if need be, is taken care of.
Great. So in our illness, about 10 to 15% of cases are due to a genetic mutation. So we do have a pretty vibrant community, a great community that's very outspoken and helps the field out a great deal of asymptomatic genetic mutation carriers. So say you have an individual who is one of these known carriers. They know they want to participate in clinical research. They very much would like to participate in a clinical treatment trial. Is there anything you could recommend to that person that they document or say that may help with possible capacity issues if they do lack capacity later on at the time that a clinical trial arises?
I just want to make sure that I've understood the question. So you're thinking about what could you do today, let's say before there's a clinical trial, to be documenting to make sure that you're set up to determine your eligibility. Is that correct?
I think it was specifically with consent, capacity for consent, which of course is at the time of the, consenting process. But there are things, we do this all the time in medicine, right? Like healthcare power of attorneys and living wills, and maybe making your wishes known that may help your legal authorized representative know that that's something you might want to do.
Absolutely. All of the above, definitely. Making sure that your family and loved ones understand your wishes, both when you might want to be in a trial and under what circumstances you might want to come out of it, if that's the case. There are individuals who have shared with myself that it can be hard to think about whether you want to continue in a trial, or maybe you want to enjoy the quality of life that you have without doing the study visits, without doing these tests. And that's such a very personal thing for everybody. So thinking about that and documenting that, and maybe your wishes as far as, if a certain milestone is reached, you would like to do XYZ, could potentially help your family and loved ones in honoring your wishes.
I did also have questions, since we're talking about finances and payments. The slide that you showed that mentioned the 3 managed access programs for investigational treatments, who pays for that?
Typically, that is the sponsor. So again, you will not be charged for the medication, but the sponsor would have to be willing to provide that on a compassionate basis, so for free, essentially, because the product is not yet licensed in the country. There can be a number of reasons why sponsors do not do that, and it's not uncommon for sponsors not to do that. And it might have nothing to do at all with the cost. It can be very difficult for sponsors to manufacture the product potentially, even just to keep trial supply going. So that will always be the priority, making sure that if there's limited supply, it's going to the clinical trial first. That's going to generate the evidence to get approval. And it can be, it can be other factors, such as it being too early, or the company feeling that there isn't enough that's known yet about the product and the risks of the product in order to feel comfortable providing it. So a lot of that is at the discretion of the sponsor. And I think that's frustrating for some individuals. By the same token, sponsors will always do everything they can to complete the clinical trials first and generate that data that can lead to approval so that it can be available to a wider population. And sometimes that's the reason why it's not being offered.
I think it's also a good question because later this month, it's on the CJD Foundation website. Professor Collins is going to give a talk of kind of a similar circumstance of something that happened in England, where they had a monoclonal antibody called PRN100. And the way that they got that used in patients is they unfortunately couldn't secure funding for a clinical trial. So they had to go a roundabout way, as what you described in the UK. And I'm sure he'll talk about that during his talk. There are lots of perturbations of how clinical trials and control groups and blindings and placebos are done that weren't gone over because, quite frankly, they do become too complicated. But if a patient is in a study, do they find out whether or not they're in the control group? If they do, when do they find out? Are they always going to be in the control group during a study?
So I'll work backwards through those. Are they always going to be in the control group in the study? That depends on the way the study was designed, because in some studies you might be in the control group for the first part of the study and then taking the product in the next part of the study. If that is scientifically available as a study design depends on a lot of factors. So not necessarily, it just depends on the study, but that's something you definitely want to ask to understand about the clinical trial you're considering. When do you find out? You don't typically find out. Nobody is going to call you up and say, hey, you were on the drug. And that is very, very frustrating. However, in a lot of rare disease clinical trials, because of the nature of the unmet need, at the end of the study, if it is promising and it looked like it was effective, individuals will often be offered the opportunity to go on something called an open label extension, which is to go onto the product and continue taking the product, regardless of whether they were control or not control, or randomized to treatment. And then they'll have access to that product until such time as the regulator has made its determination. And this is because in those cases, it could potentially be very unethical to take a treatment away from someone whose condition might progress drastically and really harm their health. The control group is something that is very hard to contend with. We hear a lot from parents and from individuals about it is psychologically hard to deal with that. However, as a wonderful physician points out, it is not always the worst thing to be randomized to the control group, because it is possible for a drug not to be effective as hoped, but to have side effects that were unpredictable or unknown. And in those cases, if you were randomized to the control group, you would have avoided that. And unfortunately, as we saw with clinical research, for everyone that makes it, there could be 4 trials that don't live up to their hope. So the control group is really hard to contend with, but if it's some consolation, sometimes it's not the worst thing to be randomized to control.
That's an excellent point, actually. Another really good question, and this is partly why we are having this talk when we are, because now it seems like industry is interested in doing some of these studies. The question is, could the CJD Foundation, as a patient advocacy group, raise money and fund clinical trials if there was a promising drug that needed clinical trial funding? So in essence, how much does a clinical trial run or cost to run? And then is that something that's feasible for a patient advocacy group to do on a small rare disease?
Typically, it's not, is the straight answer. It's extraordinarily costly. You also need to actually develop that treatment. So that's a cost in itself, right? Or to acquire or license that treatment. And that's not typically what rare disease patient organizations do. Typically, the patient organizations fund the really important initial science. So the basic science, the research into the condition, how it functions, and some translational research, or they might fund assets that, like for example, the development of animal models with certain genetic characteristics. So they often contribute funds of that in that way. Clinical trials just take a lot of funds to run, many, many millions of dollars. And a great deal of not just the money, but the expertise and that is required. So, companies like CROs will be on a daily basis working with the sponsors that are setting up the clinical trials, and that's typically not something that patient organizations are geared up to do. However, We do see patient organizations who set up sort of entrepreneurial initiatives where they might be repurposing a drug. It's rare, but it does and can happen. However, typically it's not something that's as feasible because it's so much more expensive than the basic science or developing a cell model or an animal model.
And the CJD Foundation has funded research quite a bit. You could see on their website. And it's exactly as you stated, Lara. A lot of it is preclinical models, animal models, biomarkers that are very much used in clinical trials and potentially a clinical treatment trial. I just wanted to say, some people asked about whether or not there are any current clinical trials for CJD. And unfortunately, currently there are no clinical trials for CJD, but we do expect that there will be some soon. And that's why we wanted to have a talk like this from an expert like Lara. And if you wanted more information on that, last year, one of the industry companies that is interested in clinical trials in prion disease did give a talk, and you can find that on the CJD Foundation's website. I would also say that's probably one of the better ways to find out whether or not there is an active clinical trial in prion disease. You can be sure that the CJD Foundation will make that known to the community. So Lara, thank you very much for your time tonight. I just want to end with one question for you. Say there's someone on the call who is interested in potentially participating in a clinical research study. What questions would you recommend that they ask themselves and ask the study staff that are doing the study?
All the questions, ask all the questions. I would recommend that from the moment that it occurs to you, you get a book and you just start recording every single question. If there are people that are close to you, ask the questions that they have as well. I think it's really important to consider to try and get as much information about what you're going to have to do and what sort of tests, where you're going to have to travel, what that time commitment will look like, and really sort of think that through as best you can and consider how that might fit into your life. So how will your life change potentially? And are you comfortable with that? Really take your time, and it's absolutely fine if your thoughts and opinions shift about that. The study team, I would absolutely ask them to take me through everything in terms of the tests. I would potentially, ask them to tell me a little bit about the science that informs that the clinical trial is ready to go. So what is known about the molecule and what it's supposed to do. A question that is always a very good question is, what could this potentially do for me? Like, what is this drug actually hoped? What is it hoped that it would do? Sometimes that's not clearly communicated just in the materials. And so we find that individuals sometimes ask that question. And it's good for physicians to be prepared with an answer, Dr. Appleby, I would say. I would say ask questions about what is and is not paid for, and really sort of think through where you could potentially have costs that might not be covered. So, and ask the question. Sometimes it's possible that a form of support may be available, but the sponsor, but it's on an as needed basis. So it may not be obvious that a form of support is available. So if you need some childcare to be able to make clinical trial visits, it may not be possible, but it's really important to ask the question. If there are barriers to you taking part in that study that come up, just ask. And it may not be possible, but always ask, because it might be, and then that might make it possible for you to continue. Ask all the questions. There's no such thing as wrong. Ask 15 times if you have to. Ask everybody is my advice.
Great. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to do this. We greatly appreciate it. I know the families greatly appreciate it. Just a reminder that all these talks are recorded and put on YouTube. If you want to watch them again, you can find that also through the CJD Foundation's website. Lara, again, thank you so much. I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.